Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel. My name is Dr. Keith Green, Program Committee member, Executive member for the BGHRA. We're really excited to continue our conversation on day 2 of the conference. And I want to introduce you to our 3 panelists. We had a scheduled panel of 4, but our 4th panelist, Melina, won't be able to make it. But please know that she would like to also send her presentation on along later. So through the BGHR archive, you will be able to hear her paper in the future. So first, we'll be going in the order presented in the program. I'd like to introduce Dr. Silker Hackenish, and then we'll have her paper followed by Mariella George, and then Kasturi Chatterjee. Dr. Silker Hackenish is an associate professor at the Institute for North American History at the University of Cologne. She specializes in 20th century childhood and adoption studies, African American history, commodity history, and Black diaspora studies. Silke is the author of Chocolate and Blackness, A Cultural History, and has edited the volume Adopting Children Across Race and Nations, Histories and Legacies with Ohio State University Press in 2022. Her most recent work, Colorblind Love or Racial Responsibility, The Adoption of Black German Children to Postwar America, currently under review, analyzes the contested debates the transnational adoption of Black German children elicited in the African American community, from civil rights and organizations to social work professionals and individual adoption advocates. And her paper is entitled The Black American Response to the Adoption of Black German Children in the 1950s. Silke, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this year's BGHRA conference, and especially thank you to you, Rosemarie. I briefly want to share with everyone that it's really because of you that I came to this research project. I met Rosemarie at a conference in 2009, and she generously shared her own story with me, which brought me to the topic that I would then research for the following years. And of course, my work is indebted to the work of Yara Colette Lemke-Munezefaria, who wrote a book about the situation of Black German children in post-war Germany. Aziza Malanda has done great work on Black Germans who grew up in institutions. And my own focus is on those children who were adopted by American families, mostly Black American families. I have some slides, so I'm going to share my presentation with you guys. I hope that works. Okay, so let me start by briefly sketching the historical context. So, as I'm sure you know, after the Second World War, Allied forces were stationed in various European nations, including Germany. And among these were white and Black American military service members. And one result of this occupation, or rather liberation, was that despite initial anti-fraternization laws, these allied forces and local women did fraternize, including so-called sex across the color line. And these relationships were regarded as a social taboo in Germany and the United States alike. And they resulted in the first mixed race babies being born as early as late 1945. And between the mid 1940s and the late 1950s, approximately 5,000 Black German children were born. And the majority of these children grew up with their mothers or extended family members. some in institutions, while others were adopted by, as I mentioned, mostly Black American couples, often military couples or military families. And initially, this was not addressed, the existence of these children. They were sometimes met with concern, curiosity, of course, also open hostility in their mothers as well. But more official debates or discourses only started in the early 1950s, because in 1952, the first cohort of these children entered the public school system in Germany and thereby moved from a more private to the public sphere. And there was a lot of debate preceding the school starting and efforts to facilitate the integration of these children, and that they needed to be integrated, and that there needed to be some sort of facility accompanying, supporting them, that was understood by educators. So there was a booklet published called Maxi, which was aimed at teachers and educators. And the idea was to educate them of the existence of Afro-German children, raise sympathy for them, and again, facilitate their integration. This publication was preceded by two conferences, again by educators, also attended by social workers, politicians, and teachers, and was also framed by anthropological studies. And these studies were largely based on interviews done by anthropologists interviewing mothers of Afro-German children and sometimes their children as well. Popularly, the existence of these children was also the plot of a very popular movie called Toxie, and you can see a film still on the right side here. Um, so Toxie is one of the first films that centers a Black character and the experiences of a Black German child. And in this film, still, you see the actor Al Husman, who plays the Black American father. And towards the end of the movie, Toxie is found by her father and is happily brought home to the United States, even though she has never met her father before. So the solution here is her emigration to the United States. And in the United States, the existence of Black German children was closely followed upon, especially in the Black press. And what was also covered in the press was the upbringing of some of these children in a segregated orphanage, which was run by Irene Dillo, which you can see here on the photograph, surrounded by some of her children. It was called the Albert Schweitzer home, hence the photograph in the back. And he had agreed to give his name to this institution and supported the idea of this segregated orphanage. And according to Irene Dillo, the segregated space should shield these children from discrimination and racial hostility. So while most of these children remained in Germany, grew up in white families, white environments, others were also adopted. And these adoptions were often facilitated by local authorities, social workers, for instance, because their mothers, young white German women, or sometimes also displaced women, were unmarried. And so by law, these children were wards of the state. And the motives of these social workers varied. Some saw adoption as a means to get rid of these children. Others thought that they would fare better in the United States with a more sizable Black community. Um, these adoptions were never officially endorsed by the US government or by the US military and were highly unregulated. So, this is before we have a social practice called international adoption. Quite the opposite, we could argue that the adoption of Black German children to the United States is the first organized transnational adoption on the basis of race, and also an example that centers Black Americans in this process. And when we look at the United States, those who took an interest in these children or were mobilized to help were often mobilized by a belief in racial liberalism and also the burgeoning struggle for civil rights. And the Black freedom struggle had become more vocal and more visible in the late 1940s and 1950s, not least due to the experiences of Black GIs in their service in theaters of war, the Double Victory campaign, and the early Cold War. So, for many Black Americans who were interested in adopting a child from Germany, this was also, so this was not an exclusively private decision, but also a political decision. They regarded these children as members of an extended Black community. They warned against the legacy of fascism in Germany. And some also turned to transnational adoption because that proved easier than navigating the domestic adoption landscape and social work regulations that often discriminated against Black families. Now, Black Americans learned about Afro-Germans and possible adoptions through the press. So, Black newspapers and Black magazines are really vital in popularizing the existence and experiences of Black Germans from that generation. They also learned about the experiences of Black military service members in the theaters of war and also of love across the color line. And sometimes that manifested itself in more juicy headlines and reporting. And here is one example from Jet, another magazine targeted towards a Black readership. And I think that this type of reporting, while it was targeted towards a largely Black American readership, also contained messages to mainstream society or white readership because it challenged and transgressed not only social taboos, but also so-called miscegenation laws in the United States. So we have articles that feature white women from Germany intentionally seeking a Black husband, not only as a father for their Black German child, but also irrespective of if they have children or not, as a partner. And the existence of Black German children was known even before, largely due to press coverage in the Pittsburgh Courier that already started in the mid 1940s. So the Pittsburgh Courier frequently reported on the experiences of Black GIs in a segregated army, and also pretty early on reported on Black German children and also their mothers. With photographs featuring individual stories and emphasizing the plight of these mothers, that there is no institutional support, that the kind of ostracism they face, And in this article, there's a list with names and addresses given of women and their children. And the idea of the newspaper was that African Americans would send care packages to these mothers and their children to support them. And it was then the readership that responded favorably to these reports that also brought up the question of adopting these children. So the newspaper received numerous letters asking if these children were up for adoption. Now, some military wives of military servicemen who were stationed in Germany had already begun to adopt Black German children. But as you can see from this quote, and this is also given to the Pittsburgh Courier, to the journalist Percival Leroy Predis, who interviewed these women in Heidelberg, they did not endorse transnational adoption. So while they argued that when Black couples, military families are stationed in Germany, it would be great if they could adopt a child or two. They did not encourage international adoptions because, according to them, these children were German, should remain in Germany, and they also voiced some concern about the acceptance of these children in the United States into Black communities. However, a huge proponent of transnational adoption was Mabel Grammer. She did not share the skepticism of the women from Heidelberg. Mabel Grammer was also the military wife of a GI who was stationed in Mannheim and a couple of years later in Karlsruhe. So they did 2 tours of duty in Germany. And throughout the years, the couple eventually adopted 12 Black German children, and Mabel Grammer initiated what she called the Brown Baby Plan. And this term, brown baby, is a source term that comes up again and again in the Black press. And before accompanying her husband to the United States, Mabel Grammer had been a journalist and a writer for the Baltimore Afro-American, another Black newspaper. And she used her access to that paper to popularize her adoption scheme and also the plight of Black German children. And so she would have articles where she featured photographs with names of children up for adoption and encouraged readers to express interest. So these readers should then write to her, give some references from the community, and ask them to pick a child from those featured in the newspaper, and then she facilitated the adoption. And the press coverage on Mabel Grammer was by and large very positive, especially in the Black press and in her own newspaper, the Afro-American. She received, however, lots of criticism from the International Social Service or the Child Welfare League because she was not a trained social worker and there was no supervision period or adoption standards implemented according to the critique. And her activism was also not endorsed by civil rights organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So we see rather ambivalent responses among different members of the Black community. And when we look at civil rights activists, they were much more cautious. And I just want to highlight the NAACP as an example here. So different chapters of the NAACP had followed the news coverage in the Pittsburgh Courier and in other newspapers and magazines, and had reached out to the headquarter of the organization, asking if the NAACP could officially take a stance and endorse these adoptions, and also pressure President Harry Truman to financially support families who adopted Black German children. And here is the official reply to that inquiry by Roy Wilkins, who was then Assistant Secretary of the NAACP. He writes, "The matter of the so-called brown babies in Europe has been before us on numerous occasions. The association has taken no position with regard to this question, and as far as I know, the government has not set up any program either. While the problem is a worthy and deserving one, it would be our feeling that our branches would have just as much as they can do in working on actual NAACP program and work. While it is very gratifying to see such a fine evidence of desire on the part of the Ithaca branch to work on the matter in question, we do not feel that such a matter is within the scope and purview of NAACP program." And I think it's quite interesting because according to Wilkins, the organization officially considered these children to be German, and thus German society, post-war society, needed to accommodate them. And so while the NAACP expresses a genuine interest and also concern for the well-being of these children and how they fared in Germany, they did not seem to share the same sense of racial responsibility that Mabel Grammer would refer to in her writing for her newspaper. Instead, what the NAACP did was that they observed the integration into German society. And here again, I think the civil rights movement within the US comes in to play, because Walter White, president of the NAACP, and others would write about the school start of the first cohort of children in 1952 and critically comment to its American readerships in the sense of, hey, look, this is Hitler Germany, and these children are going to school along white students. Post-war Germany did not introduce a segregated school system, but here in the United States, the beacon of democracy, we still have school segregation, because segregation in public school would only be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court 2 years later. So in that sense, maybe we could say that the remaining of these children in Germany and their integration was productive for the NAACP to critique the status quo on civil rights in the United States. So to wrap this up, I find the history of Afro-German adoptees to the United States compelling. It's the first organized transnational adoption endeavor on the basis of race, but much less visible in the historiography of international adoption. And while we have Black Americans like Mabel Grammer being mobilized by reference to the Shoah, race hatred in Germany, and their own civil rights activism, we also have actors in that civil rights establishment being much more cautious and connecting the experiences of Afro-German children to their own struggle for civil rights in the United States. And I hope with this brief glimpse into the situation, I could give you some ideas about the sometimes conflicting and ambivalent responses to Afro-German children in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Silke. A lot to think about there. I want to get to our next presenter, but before I do that, we want to folks that the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, that's the great place that we have for questions or even just comments. So as our presenters are talking, you can go ahead and start to put your questions in the Q&A tab. So next up, we have Mariella George, who is an Afro-Latina German, holds a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and an MA in Human Resources. Since 2014, she has been professionally engaged in anti-discrimination work and is a co-founder of the Federal Expert Network on Health and Racism. In 2019, she founded Empowermental to support BIPOC individuals through workshops that promote critical awareness of power structures and emphasize the importance of physical and mental health. Her presentation is entitled Diaspora, Identity, and Healing Pathways to Critical Wellness. Mariella, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Good morning, or also good afternoon, everyone. So that's a radical change of topics. And I want to begin saying that you can tell you've been living in Europe for too long when you start complaining about the rain. Coming from Bolivia, where we only had 2 seasons, rainy and dry, it was never something to complain about. But now I find myself saying things like, oh, it's raining again? As if I've forgotten rain is a sign of life and renewal. It's funny how our environments shape us, even when we don't notice. My name, you already said my name. My name is Maria Görg, and I'm an Afro-Latina German born in Cochabamba, Bolivia, to an Afro-Peruvian mother and a German father. My upbringing across cultures has deeply influenced my work as an anti-discrimination practitioner. I work as a public officer at the State Anti-Discrimination Office of Hesse. I'm an activist and author. Today, I'm speaking to you as an empowerment trainer and mental health coach. In this context, I have been asking myself the following question. How do we navigate the fractures of our identities, histories, and communities to move toward healing and justice? This presentation introduces the concept of critical wellness as a process for individuals and communities to reckon with collective trauma and systemic inequities, while cultivating resilience and agency. For those of us in diasporic contexts, critical wellness emphasizes the importance of reconnecting with our roots, embracing hybrid identities, and fostering solidarity across transnational networks. Through my journey, I've come to understand the complexities of identity and the challenges of belonging, experiences that have shaped my framework of critical wellness. Critical wellness is about more than self-care. It's about radical self-care as a form of political resistance, inspired by Black feminist thinkers like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde. It's a framework that connects personal healing with collective liberation. As Hooks reminds us, living as we do in a white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal context that can best exploit us when we lack a firm grounding in self and identity, choosing wellness is an act of political resistance. Let's dive in. So what is critical wellness? At its core, critical wellness is about addressing the toll systemic discrimination takes on our minds, bodies, and souls. It's about fostering practices that nurture well-being while actively resisting oppressive systems. Importantly, critical wellness is not about productivity. It's not about being better for the system. It's about being better for ourselves and our communities. One of the central tenets of critical wellness is the belief that healing is inherently political. As Bell Hooks wrote, before many of us can effectively sustain engagement and organized resistance struggle, we need to undergo a process of self-recovery that can heal individual wounds that may prevent us from functioning fully. This process of self-recovery is not just for personal benefit. It lays the foundation for our ability to build and sustain movements for justice. In one of my workshops, I asked participants to reflect on this question and try to remember how it feels. What does discrimination feel like in your body? The responses were powerful. Some spoke of tension in their shoulders, others of a deep exhaustion that felt inescapable, hypervigilance, fast heart beating, tummy ache is also typical, and many symptoms more. These are all symptoms of stress. Recognizing these physical manifestations of oppression is a key step in reclaiming our well-being. Let's talk about how critical wellness works in practice. I will give you some examples for individual and community practices. Critical wellness begins with small intentional acts of self-care that prioritize healing over productivity. For example, in a workshop segment focused on self-reflection, we practice different techniques of mindful breathing. One participant shared, "This is the first time I felt like I could just breathe without pressure or judgment." Reflective journaling, drawing, and group discussions are some other tools I like to use. Prompts like, "What would a world look like where my well-being is prioritized?" allows participants to envision possibilities beyond their current struggles. Healing doesn't happen in isolation. In a workshop segment on collective care, we created a space for participants to share their experiences with racism and how it affected their mental health. We paired this with group storytelling, where individuals shared moments of resilience and joy despite adversity. One participant remarked, "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear these stories. It reminded me I'm not alone." In another session, we explored mindful body movement practices like somatic shaking and body tapping, not as a performance, but as a way to reconnect with our physical selves. I like to introduce tools from different cultural traditions, as well as science-based practices, such as those used to regulate the vagus nerve. Now, these are practices to regulate stress. Also, rest as resistance. One workshop included a segment where participants were simply invited to rest. No phones, no pressure, just rest. The goal was to reclaim rest as a radical act in a world that demands constant overwork, particularly from marginalized groups. Another session focused on the quote by Toni Morrison, "The function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work." Participants explored how prioritizing wellness allows us to focus on what truly matters rather than being consumed by oppression. These practices highlight how critical wellness bridges the gap between individual healing and collective empowerment. So let's connect critical wellness to the conference themes, reckoning, and justice. Reckoning. Critical wellness helps us reconnect with our roots and cultural legacies. As Bell Hooks said, beloved community is formed not by the eradication of difference, but by its affirmation, by each of us claiming the identities and cultural legacies that shape who we are. In one workshop, participants shared stories from their families and cultural traditions, rediscovering a sense of pride and belonging. Reckoning. Healing requires to confront the realities of systemic violence. In another session, participants explored the impacts of discriminations on their bodies and minds. A participant shared, "I didn't realize how much I carried until I put it into words." This reckoning is a necessary step toward healing and transformation. As for justice, critical wellness empowers us to turn personal healing into collective action. When we prioritize wellness, we make space for sustainable activism and justice work. One participant summarized it beautifully. "Taking care of myself isn't selfish, it's necessary for the fight ahead." So critical wellness is not a one-time fix, it's a continuous journey. It's about showing up for ourselves and our communities, even in the chaos we live in. Reckoning, and justice are not just ideals. They are practices we must live every day. By reconnecting with ourselves and each other, we lay the foundation for the futures we want to see. As Bell Hooks said, there can be no love without justice, care, and affirmation. The opposite of abuse and humiliation are the foundation of love. Let us center care and affirmation in our work and in our lives. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Mariella. Again, please put your questions or comments in the Q&A box. I'm looking forward to the discussion portion in just a few moments. I'm going to introduce now our third and final presenter. We have Kasturi Chatterjee, and I'll give you a bit of bio for them. Kasturi is a Bengali South Asian doctoral student from India who works with Black German studies, colonial histories, philosophy, literature, art history, and film studies. They are a second-year teaching fellow at the Carolina Duke graduate program in German studies. They hold one MA in sociology, and another in German studies with a major in translation studies. Their research at the doctoral program at UNC Duke involves parsing out the differences and intersections between poetic and literary archives. As such, they work in the broader field of colonial histories and audiovisual and literary production that highlights the silences of historical archival knowledge. Currently, they are engaged in a project that studies the presence and valences of Afro-surrealism in Black German literature and visual art. And their paper is entitled, or presentation is entitled, Afro-Pessimism and Afro-Surreal Insurrection in Ada's Rom. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's see. Are you able to see the full screen presentation? Awesome. And then I will begin. So, hello everyone, and thank you to the BGHRA Review Committee and the organizers for this lovely opportunity to share my work today. I also thank my esteemed fellow panelists for their presentations and my advisor, Dr. Elaine, for supporting my work through everything. And I'm already anticipating a great round of discussions, drawing together all of the diverse themes, wonderful themes of our panel. Let me begin then by paying my respects to Henry Dumas, Amiri Baraka, Susanna Césaire, Sylvia Winters, Hortense Pillars, and Saidia Hartman, whose pioneering work in their respective fields has inspired my reading of the creation myth at the heart of Ada's journey. Remembering the strength that scholars and artists can draw from art, poetry, and critical theory always helps us reckon with historical traumas, perhaps as presented in works like Ada's Realm. It would be a mistake, however, to only mention Ada's pain, since there is a lot of her joy we also witness in this painful and at the same time defiant celebration of the Black woman's labor and her desire. Thus, I'm excited to present my reading of this wonderful, delightful, yet simultaneously heart-wrenchingly painful storytelling that refuses objects and material Wiedergutmachung as the sole focus of reparative justice. The novel, to begin with, is a journey of sorts, a quest, as many like to put it, of a woman named Ada, and how she retains her humanity over centuries of dehumanization that she's subjected to. The book gives the reader a tantalizing set of clues as to how and where Ada is resurrected, twice as a black woman and twice as a white woman, thrice losing her child as well as her life. Scholars have studied the matrilineality as well as the ethics of care in the novel's Afropean cosmology. Others have studied the novel in terms of the golden fertility bracelet that ultimately remains stolen from Ada's Ghanaian community of women who reject the item when it is offered back to them with the words, Wie wollen Sie uns etwas zurückgeben, das Ihnen nie gehört hat, ne? Something like that. I'm paraphrasing, of course. In the closing scenes of the novel, this scene is one that inspires awe in the reader, as Ada is not speaking alone, even though she stands by herself. She says, Wir wollen das Armband zurück, sagte sie schließlich. Ihre Stimme war ruhig. Ihre Hände streichelten ihren Bauch. End quote. While we do not have time to read together this entire scene right now, for those who have yet to read the novel, I can tell you without needing a spoiler alert that both the son of the man with the Nazi Hintergrund, Herr Wilhelm, with whom she's talking, and Ada, they both speak in many voices in this scene. Herr Wilhelm speaks with the ancestral voices of his fellow colonizing and looting people, I guess, while Ada speaks in the voices of all her past selves, her mothers, whose names and histories she has recently, at the behest of God herself, remembered in a series of dream sequences. This scene, like many in the novel, is what we can identify as the Afro-surreal insurrectionary mode of writing. While the word insurrection commonly, perhaps simplistically, is understood to mean a violent uprising against an authority or a government, it can also be understood as non passive resistance towards an oppressive system, including those that benefit from such a system. This is how Ada, even with her partner Cash in the 21st century Berlin that she comes into, does not shy away from her power as a woman with eine Macht zur Selbstbestimmung. She takes this as selbstverständlich, despite all of the signals from which the world she is born into deny her such a choice to determine herself and her history. I will attenuate the explanation I have for how Odu constructs this world in a way that makes apparent in the text its Afro pessimist structures for lack of time. Let us instead turn to the response Ada has, which Odu has used tools that may be studied through a tradition and heritage of Afro surrealism. Afro-surrealism, defined most succinctly and famously by Amiri Baraka in his iconic essay on Henry Dumas' short story collection Bone of Arc, is a method of creative expression that creates, to also borrow from Hartman's words, fabulates another world that is organically connected to this one. Indeed, Ada's resurrection, as evidenced by the explanation of the Wurstherstellung by God and an accompanying unidentified speaker, seems to present us with clues to such a connection. Um, and on page 128, I can read like a short excerpt, I suppose. Das letzte Mal, als wir sie zwischen den Schleifen aufgespürt haben, hatte sie bei unserer Ankunft große Augen gemacht, wie sie es immer getan hat, wie sie es immer tun wird. Das hatte weniger mit unserer Erscheinung zu tun, als mit dem, was wir ihr sagen wollten. Denn um die fließenden Übergänge zwischen uns einigermaßen nachvollziehbar beschreiben zu können, erzählt Gott Ada immer wieder, wie zum ersten Mal, von der Wurstherstellung. Already, we can tell that this connection between Ada and God, mediated by an unidentified entity who inhabits the broom, the door knocker, the Katzetlager walls, and finally a pre-Brexit British passport, has appeared before. This dialogue has happened before. This explanation of the Wurstherstellung has happened before. It will happen again. The presence of the bread, if you read further in the story, for those who have read, I don't have to explain, but he says that this sausage making happens from a flesh which has which has like a bunch of mixed different personalities, a bunch of various characteristics, skurrile Vorlieben, various preferences. But finally, it all comes out of the sausage maker like sausages that look like each other. So the presence of the bread, that is the sausage meat, as the only fitting image for the material basis of life is the absurdist humor in her use of the German language. The creation of humans in the image of a sausage as the only fitting metaphor for how humans work or are made indicates several semantic levels of meaning. The Wurst, the quintessential German icon of culinary excellence, dare one say, is also a word that signifies indifference in the sense of mir ist das Wurst, that God and her mechanism of the conception and creation of life is indifferent to the modes of categorization that humans themselves might impose upon one another. But more profanely, Wurst can also signify the phallic organ, and as an extension of the poetic humor being practiced here, the phallic logic of natality itself. Patrimonial inheritance is seen in terms of ownership, property, and inheritance, most prominently in the passing down of colonial loot. I just found like a picture of a bracelet. You can just imagine the bracelet is obviously a work of fiction. So Verse can also signify the phallic organ as an extension of the poetic humor being practiced here, the phallic logic of natality itself. Patrimonial inheritance is seen in terms of ownership, property, and inheritance, most prominently in the passing down of colonial loot in the novel, signified in the Goldene Perlenkette, a 15th century fertility bracelet from the Gold Coast. In the case of the communal function of this bracelet, which is converted into an object of men's desire, passed down from the hands of one man to another over the course of the centuries before it turns up in the Berlin Ethnological Museum exhibit. Ultimately, the refusal on Ada and her community of ancestors' part happens in the scene that we just read above. Ada, in her dream, has remembered her mothers, who she has forgotten over various rebirths. She's reminded of their histories in the dream sequence after the chapter Between the Orbits. Let us then return to this place between the orbits again. What kind of space is this? The speaker says. Dort, wo die bereits Verstorbenen und die noch nie Geborenen verweilen, indicates a few different things. Most prominently, this space may be read as Asamando, the land of spirits where the ancestors live. Kyung Ho Cha has explained in his essay on the ethics of care and Ghanaian cosmology in the novels. He says, I quote, the corporal world where people live is called Viase. Asamando and Viase are not strictly separated. The spiritual world of the ancestors is in no sense another world, but rather part of this world. End quote. Further, the use of the words so was wie ein Brät and so was wie ein Fleischwolf suggest that the material conditions of conception, creation, and becoming into existence of the Mensch do not allow for expression in logical terms set forth by the imperial tongue, in this case German. O2, I reckon, recognizes that to express the Afro surreal nature of Asamando's presence in her novel calls for a bit of irony and linguistic play. And what better way to do this than to reverse the terms of the creation of human difference? Hortense Spillers notes how the captive body of the enslaved is converted into flesh. The opposite might be said to be true of the metaphor of the Wurstherstellung, I would like to suggest. Flesh being converted into humans, a reversal of Hegelian logic? Jokes aside, this problem of linguistic determinacy has been already foreshadowed by the same speaker, one may assume, in the award winning short story Herr Gertrude setzt sich hin, also by O2, of course. I will not go into that beautiful scene for now. Let us stay with the description of the sausage making. The sentence, dabei geht es nicht um das Fleisch an sich, sondern um die Form, genau genommen um die Aufteilung einer Masse, die in ihrem Ursprung aus fröhlich munteren Tieren besteht und am Ende nach entsprechender Bearbeitung als einzelne fein säuberlich getrennte dickliche Würstchen erscheint. We may surmise that one sausage resembles the next in all outward traits, another level of reversals of logic of categorizations that humans subject themselves to. The Fleischmasse, arbitrarily fertiled, is what comprises human difference and not their outward appearance. Each Würstchen looks like the next. Thus, we may determine Ada's white and black avatars, sausage like, as different not because of how they look, but because of the flesh that makes them up, in the words of God's logic herself, arbitrarily. So I'm looking forward to discussing all of these like readings that I shared with you in the Q&A, and then I'll conclude. The ultimate act of Afro-Surrealist insurrection in the novel is the transformation of Ada's desire to trace her heritage in terms of lost mothers, and this culminates in the birth of a daughter who is depicted as asleep and dreaming at the close of Ada and her daughter's exhausting journey through centuries of misogynoir. Prior to this, Ada remembers her forgotten mother's names in a series of dreams, like I said, as presented to us as filmic montages, identifiable by the timestamps provided in the text. Rochelle Spencer has noted this as a well recognized Afro Surrealist strategy, this filmic nature of the text. Ada does not identify her mother's history and names through outward appearance based categorization used as a tool of empire. Her ethnicity we see over the epic narration of resurrection, fugitivity, and ultimately self assertion in the face of overwhelming odds does not appear to be a factor that saves her from men's violent desire. To be sure, these overwhelming odds are a direct result of the violent desire that a Eurocentric surrealist desire has noted as the key to surrealist love. Afro surrealist love, however, is different. uh, Ashley Myers writes, surrealists are emotional separatists, yet in demanding space for another mode of being, an account of what is possible if we are divorced from all recognizable time and space, they also reach out for a social politics that is viscerally real. In following Maya Angelou, she explains how the Haitian painter Prefet Dufault opens into an emotional tenor that Angelou describes as agape, which gospel singers would call a higher love, encompassing God's love for all mankind, and just as importantly, our love for each other on God's model. Perhaps creativity is in its essence this form of love, a form of imagination, transportation, and transcendence. Agape love is a sacred communal romance that hinges less on individual desire than a collective aspiration towards dream states. Agape is not carnal, but rather spatial, liquid, and delicate. This is in comparison to European surrealism, which has its own image of love, l'amour fou, I guess, mad love, which was uncontrolled desire, perhaps obsessive, perverse, and even violent. It freed the lover but destroyed its object, often through ravishment or rape. European surrealists sometimes played this for comedy, admittedly, but in daydreaming of art's liberatory forces, um, she, Myers, writes that I and others prefer something else. Our forced otherness demands nourishment. I think she's quoting Angelou here, not being consumed. We have too often been on the wrong end of Europe's mad love. So she's talking about the Caribbean here, and then we find mad love inverted and turned into the purposes of agape, generating a surrealism unique to this love. So I'll end with that, and I'm really looking forward to discussing with all of you. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all three of our presenters. You've given us so much to think about. I already see one question in the Q&A, but please go ahead if you have comments, questions, go ahead and put them in that box. So I want to start off actually by kind of raising a point that I think was brought up by all three presenters, and maybe just in the order that you presented, you could all just take a few moments to reflect on it. I'm struck by the role of the nation across all three of your presentations, both as a site where um, a kind of violence, you might say, is enacted, right? A site where definitions are kind of being imposed, right? But also as a site where people have opportunities to kind of rethink or certain opportunities are available, right? I don't want to kind of answer the question for you, but I'm just seeing it move through each of your talks in different ways. So again, in the order that you presented, and maybe if you just reflect on what the nation what's happening with the nation in your individual works to kind of limit on some ways, but also to open up some possibilities as well. Silka, if you wouldn't mind starting us, please.
Yes, sure, Keith. Thank you so much for that question. I think there's a lot to unpack. I think the concept of the nation, when we think of international adoption, is it um, it is challenged and affirmed at the same time, quite often. And I think with the example of the Black German children, what is interesting about in these debates is that legally they were German citizens, but they were not considered to be really German because of this. It was perceived as being black could not possibly also mean to be German. And that goes back to German colonialism and citizenship laws that were created in that context. And so there was this friction that on a legal basis alone was not there. But the existence of these children was by some seen as a threat to the German nation. On the other hand, some also argued that keeping these children in Germany and doing a good job integrating them would be helpful in atoning for the sins of the Nazi regime, being beneficial in promoting a new image of the German nation. But in general, I think there's this sense that yes, they might be German, but not really. And do they belong here? And we see this tension also with how is race defined? Is it something biological, or we shouldn't do that anymore? So it's more sociological. Um, but the identity of these children is constantly negotiated in terms of racial identity and national belonging, and it's an ongoing tension, I think.
Thank you for that. And I was really struck by, and thanks for that kind of useful contextualization. Also struck by the Roy Wilkins response, right? Which is almost to say as if we're the National Association for Colored People, right? Not the International Association. So this kind of is really beyond like how we've been thinking about race here. So maybe this one branch wants to address that, but actually we're not really, that's not what we're about. um,
Yeah, if I could just briefly respond to that, that is a great comment. And the statement is much longer. And at the end, he says something like, Black children in Savannah, Georgia might be worse off. And this should be our focus,
mhm,
poor, rural Black children
mhm, mhm.
in the US.
That's fascinating, fascinating. Mariella, please. So again, it's addressing this question of in your own work, which I think it seems different, but actually I think it's really quite connected to kind of all that we've been discussing, how the nation kind of matters here.
Yeah, Silke already said it. It's a tension between belonging and not belonging. And right now, the discussion, for example, in Germany is about who belongs here and who doesn't belong, who should be taking the German citizenship away and who has to return to their countries. In most of their cases, those countries don't exist because we're talking about a lot of German born here and born and raised in Germany. So my topic is about health, mental health, physical health. So everything Silke spoke about is linked with collective trauma that we feel individually and collectively until today. And it's also linked to this construct of nation, who belongs and who doesn't belong. So, racism and nation are always linked together, and how they affect our health. Yeah.
And I really appreciate it. Thank you for that. This concept of critical wellness, right? So the idea that I'm using hooks that wellness is also a political act, right? It's personal, of course, but it's also a political act. And so in that sense, then to kind of talk about, healing, we can't talk about healing without considering, right, the kind of transnational, international, national dimensions of that. Um, and I think this is kind of really kind of important. I think for me personally, I mean, being someone who was born in Jamaica, but then coming to the US, and I think about my own kind of story of wellness, I can't disentangle kind of like what like what a national border does for and to and against that, right? So I think all of those things I hear that in your work. Castori, please jump on in.
hmm I was also like thinking about who's allowed to be unwell, for example, like the American gymnast, the black lady, when she wanted to take time off, a lot of people just jumped on it and they were like, how dare she do this, She just wanted to like get better. And when she came back, all of these same people were like, oh, we love her and all of this. Just as an aside, you know. But yeah, so apart from that, I was thinking about the concept of the nation as a territoriality based concept, like always expanding, in comparison to land. And many thinkers already talk about this in their work as well. For example, we think of the British passport that Ada has, which is soon going to be not valid anymore. It's because like the nation as a category keeps changing depending on the flux of politics. And I guess Ada's realm is all about embracing that flux instead of like resisting it, like thinking about static categories, thinking about race, but also like land in terms of like a static entity that doesn't never change, and ethnicity. Spillers also talks about in her work, is thought of as a static thing that never changes, and that is very easy to use against people, against people, to categorize them and then dominate them, which again is like a huge theme. So it doesn't matter if Ada's Polish, or if she's Irish, or if she's English, or if she's like Ghanaian or German. It doesn't matter in the book. That's why when it ends with the birth of Ada's daughter, the circle of matrilineality begins again, because it's through the women who are always like needing to be dominated for the nation's project of territoriality, which Ada resists then, or Otu resists through her book. Yeah.
No, I love those observations. I mean, thinking about Ghana in particular, I mean, like thinking about the conference as a group, But then like the kind of idea of Ghana says that, like Togo is not Ghana, right? Cote d'Ivoire is not Ghana, but then Akan people, right? Literally on both sides of whatever border you want to make up, right? So this idea that the nation feels given, but you're right, it's always expanding, which kind of further troubles, right? Kind of how people see
Mhm.
themselves. Yeah. Wonderful. I want to get to some of the comments, questions in the Q&A. So this is for Silka in particular. Could you say a bit more about the role that anti-miscegenation ideals slash laws in both Germany and the US played in Mabel Grammer's motivations for her Brown Baby program?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. I think what was interesting when I started researching this topic, it really stood out that there's almost no coverage at all in American newspapers, except for Black newspapers and magazines. And the only reason I can think of is because of so-called miscegenation or anti-miscegenation laws, that there was zero interest in amplifying these stories, and that it happened. And This was really, I was really intrigued by that. There's one exception with Pearl Buck, who I think is not that well known anymore, an American writer, but the first American to win a Nobel Prize for Literature, also the Pulitzer Prize. So she was very popular, successful at her time, and she was also an advocate for many humanitarian causes. She was involved in civil war in China, in a lot of humanitarian causes in Asian countries. She also adopted internationally, and among her adoptees is also one Black German girl. So she adopted Henriette when she was already quite advanced in age, and that sometimes comes up in the mainstream or press. But other than that, it doesn't happen. And um, in the Black press, I think we have a lot of coverage, also very positive coverage on Mabel Grammer and the adoption, because for many Black Americans and how they talked about their adoption, not only as a private choice to fulfill longing for a child, but also to articulate humanitarian activism, especially in this post-war, more international moment. And of course, they could also um, um, articulate a certain middle class status, that they had the means to have a child fly over to the US and provide for that child. So maybe in a way they via adopting could also inscribe themselves um, in this all-American family myth that was strictly heteronormative, middle class, but also white in the popular imagination. So them adopting was also a critique of this whole discourse of dysfunctional Black families, absent, irresponsible fathers, because here we had Black men who maybe were maybe not the biological fathers, but were eager to take up the responsibility of others men's actions. And Mabel Grammer herself, for instance, there's a lot of exchanges, letter exchanges between Mabel Grammer and the International Social Service that was so critical of her adoption scheme. Um, she perceived this critique to be racially motivated, and she said so explicitly in her letter, that she's getting all this critique because she is a Black woman. And what she emphasized again and again was the sense of urgency, these children need help now, because we don't know how the situation in Germany will evolve, and your emphasizing adoption standards, your insistence on what you call red tape, is detrimental to the well-being of these children. And this message really resonated with large majority of the readership. And in the letters, she also connected her activism to civil rights, in the sense that she emphasized that she is an American citizen, and she can do, like all others, be involved in humanitarian issues, in international campaigns. And these children came under the refugee relief immigration, not refugee relief, excuse me, could immigrate as refugees. So legally, while international adoption was unregulated, it was legal in the sense because there were no laws she was violating. There were no laws at all, because international adoption was something novel at that moment. I think I've gone off now, Mel. I hope that answered your question.
No, I think hopefully for the writer of the question, I'm sorry to identify the name. I'm sorry, Jennifer. That was from Jennifer Creech. I think hopefully it did address it. So I want to get to a question that actually touches on Kasturi's and Mariella's work. But really briefly, while we're talking about just kind of the miscegenation laws, I'm also struck by the role of this Jet magazine, which is just this incredible powerhouse in the mid 20th century, kind of all the things that it does. I'm thinking about Emmett Till in particular, right? And kind of the ways in which like that particular periodical kind of function to kind of galvanize Black people. And this kind of as a kind of this idea in terms of um, what domestically was also happening with kind of ideas about Black people, but also Black men in particular, Black males and white women. It feels as if that's also, I guess, part of this strange kind of dynamic domestically is, I guess, working through what does it mean to kind of have these children come over, but then also kind of take care of our own children at the same time. I guess that's also what's being negotiated. Not so much a question, but it's kind of a thinking out loud there. Um, Castore, you were talking about kind of Afro-surrealism, and what struck me in both your presentation as well as with Mariella's, um, but obviously because of your background as well as the issue of translation. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering what does translation have to like how does that impact um this idea of fabulating a different world. And for Mariella, I'm thinking through again this really kind of useful concept of critical wellness. Like how does language um how is it implicated in our wellness or in our hurt, right? How is whether translation or whether moving between languages, how does that kind of operate as a way to navigate like these terrains of wellness or unwellness or so forth? So in either order, either one of you could start to address the topic.
Mariela, I invite you to start if you would like to.
Okay. Well, I think the most significant way I address this topic of language in my workshops is how we talk about ourselves. So like how we define ourselves also defines our reality. And there's a lot of empowerment in not letting other people's define your identity, but defining yourself. So a lot of tools and activities we do are surrounding this topic of self-definition. And also I work with Glaubenssätze, like thoughts you have about yourself. Yeah, not also who am I, but also what am I good in, and I'm worthy, I'm useful, I'm intelligent, etc. So as BIPOC individuals in Germany or in other white supremacist nations, you're confronted with a lot of stigmata, and it's a daily activity, a daily must to rewire your thoughts and think about yourself positively in a positive way, also like self-affirmation. So I would say self-affirmation is the most important language tool you can use. And talking about translation, it's also important to use your I don't say mother tongue, but your like heart language, the language you dream in, the language you would communicate with somebody you love. So use this language for yourself too. So it doesn't have to be necessarily German. Maybe it's another language. Kasturi.
Certainly. That's so beautiful because you talked about, creating yourself in your heart language, which I find also happening in Ada. There's so many different languages that is, first of all, used in the book. But also, like I mentioned, Herr Gyotrub setzt sich hin, in which the spirit who's talking in Ada's realm, we can understand the spirit goes in an egg, and this egg is speaking to us the whole time, narrating the whole story. It compares language to a cage, it says. If you just think in one language, it can cage you and you might feel stuck. So I think maybe O2's process was like, going out of the German tongue, because she uses Ga and Twi and Irish and, like so many different languages to talk about the things that she needs to, say to express what she has to say in this novel. So, and she does it in a way that we would say das ist selbstverständlich. Of course, you can't just use German to say every idea that you need to say. And so there's no need to translate at all times. There's translation is important, but we also need to decide when we actually need it. So I'm grateful, of course, for Joncho Polizzi's beautiful translation of the novel. But of course, I take, as a person who's very involved in translation myself, I'm like, oh, I don't like that translation. And that's very important. Like, readers need to know which parts of the translation they want to take and which ones they would like to like change. And that's part of being beautiful in a beautiful linguistic, polylinguistic community, I was thinking. Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. I'm also kind of wondering if that also involved not just simply kind of moving from like one language to another, but also like within the language itself. So I don't speak Tree to be clear, but I have enough Ghanaian friends, right, who are fluent, and I've also noticed kind of how like how their tree is impacted by English and French, and so like even within the language itself, like many
Hmm.
times it's colored, it's textured by all these kind of influences, and to call them
Absolutely.
national languages doesn't even make sense because they're just so hybrid in different ways.
Which that you've touched on this beautiful point where God in Ada's Ram is not only a she but also a wind and various other takes various different forms, but also speaks in Berlinisch, for example. Uses the Berliner Schnauze. And I'm not like, I don't speak Ghanaian languages, but I'm sure there's dialectical inflections there, which is, yeah, it's always like a pleasure. And I think recently I read somewhere that the French language in the imperial way is not even like the most spoken type of French anymore. I don't think it ever might have been, because there's more French speakers who are not, in France at this point. So
Yeah, yeah. Speaking to like territorial expansion, right, right.
absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, any part of Africa, I'm sure would double, triple the numbers. So there you have it. Wonderful. So again, please, folks, we have the Q&A box. Go ahead and jump in to put any questions there. There is a comment there, but I'm not entirely sure if it's a question, more of just simply an observation. Um, I'm speaking to a different story, so I'm gonna let it be actually for the moment. I'm not sure if it's actually being phrased as a question. Um, So we were presenting earlier, Silka, and I actually kind of gave you this symbol for like 1 minute left. So I wasn't sure if we would have enough time at the end. Were there comments left or other slides that you wanted to kind of just simply maybe just address now verbally, since we do have a little extra time at the end, maybe to comment on now?
Thank you, Keith. No, I was actually really at the end, maybe just rushing a little bit to wrap it up for the audience. I just had a look at the comment about Ika Hügel Marshall's story. She wrote a memoir that was also translated into English, and her experience because she grew up in Germany partly in institutions, and was able to, well, rekin with her Black American father. And of course, that is true for many adoptees. So what I focus on is just one example, but the experiences of Black Germans or Black Americans of German ancestry is very diverse, and some in some cases, those who migrated to the United States did so with both of their biological parents. Usually, the GIs had to petition the military board for permission to get married, and in most cases, this application was denied. And the military also quite often transferred Black GIs onto Korea to prevent any further relationship, or but in some cases the couples got permission to get married, and then the partner would go back to the United States with his white German wife and their child. For others, however, this scenario was so frightening because they were so nervous about what would happen if they would go back home with a white wife, that was a reason not to pursue this relationship. So we have all kinds of situations, and yeah. Or maybe just one little remark. What I also found in the sources of the International Social Service was that GIs, upon returning to the United States, reached out to the International Social Service and asked them to locate their child and the mother, and send them money. And they didn't, they were hesitant to do so themselves or openly because they had a family in the United States. But these sources also contradict this whole discourse of the absent, irresponsible father.
Mm. As Mariella was talking about, there's one question that she mentioned that was asked of some of, and I wasn't sure if it was actually of actual people that you've worked with, children you've worked with, but a really kind of profound question, like how does discrimination feel in your body, right? To me, that's like a really just kind of encapsulates so much of what we've been thinking about in terms of the nation, power, hybridity, etc. And I was wondering, for Silka, but this kind of goes to the other presenters as well. Um, what type of work has been done to kind of talk? I mean, obviously it's sensitive to kind of have these conversations, but for the actual children themselves, the ones that we kind of think about in terms of being like kind of being moved about from nation to nation, from place to place, um, do we have, for lack of a better word, kind of ethnographic studies that kind of reflect in their own voices what they thought of what was happening, what it kind of means for them, both at the level of the body, but also kind of more broadly? Can we say anything about what's been kind of done to kind of figure through those questions?
Yeah. So I think they're not that. I mean, some of the adoptees have published their memoirs, and I think this is really great. Those who I think this is also can also be a really difficult task, mentally and physically, then, and really hard, and um, so I understand why people might be very hesitant to do so. But those who have shared their experiences, this is extremely insightful to read. And there have been some documentaries, but I think Rosemarie is really the expert here because she has critically engaged with these documentaries about these adoptions. I'm sorry, I lost my thread here. What I wanted to say, I think it would be really, really great if the BGHRA, and I think Rosemarie is invested in that, could, for those who are willing to share their stories, create an online archive, for instance, and feature some of these stories because they are so diverse, and everybody has their own personal story. And I think it would be a really, really great resource and legacy at the same time to make them accessible and available.
No, no, I appreciate your response. I totally agree that it is also, of course, a very personal story. And so then kind of the fine line between kind of how much folks are able, right, willing to share, what that sharing means, depending on the platform and the audience, kind of raises all the questions that we've been kind of thinking through here. And then Mariella and Castori as well, please, if you'd like to just kind of reflect. I mean, even for a fictional work, I think that these questions of memory and representation, like how to narrate that, obviously are important as well.
Mariella, would you like to start? Okay, well, then I would just want to add this comment that, it's there's so many scenes in the novel, and I'll use one example when Ada is looking for houses, right, in her time in Berlin, and she has a half sister, Elle, and both of them go around looking for houses. And one of these ladies who's like advertised the house, and Elle is half white, so she always has to use her name to, like, apply for the house, even for even the showing to happen. And so they go there, and this lady won't even look at Ada. She talks to Elle the whole time. And, so there's like that scene where Ada bemühte sich Augenkontakt mit ihr. Wenn sie mich nur anschauen würde, dachte Ada, wenn sie mich einfach nur ansehen würde, and ansehen is in italicized, sicherlich würde sie mich nicht abweisen können, wenn sie mich kennenlernen würde. So it's like, it's very embodied here. She like, her whole being is being like rejected by this woman. So there's so many levels to it. And then Ada pulls her sister. She says, "Let's not talk to her because she's not even, And she compares, like, there's like a comparison to a fly on the wall, which nobody notices, but the fly is not. It's like sort of that kind of thing is happening in this scene. And there's many different. And O2 uses this embodied, way of experiencing not just racial but also gender discrimination and many other kinds, class discrimination in the novel. To construct the Afro-pessimist world within which then she resists this world using the Afro-surrealist strategies. My whole essay is like 30 pages, so obviously I had to cut a lot out, but yeah.
Yeah. So from my perspective, I would like to add that something called racism-based traumatic stress, or racism-based traumatic stress injury, is something Robert Carter studied for the past 22 years. So it's new in psychology and new in science to actually study and address the effects of racism and not discrimination, but specifically racism on mental and physical health. So I don't think there are any reports from adoptees or memoirs which really address all topics you would if you use the tool Robert Carter designed for it's like a test. No, it's a test, and at the end you give a person a diagnose, like this person is she or he or they are they suffering from racism based traumatic stress. And in Germany, the study of racismusbedingten Stress, racism-based traumatic stress, is also very new, very new. Like, that's why I founded this network of called Bundesfachnetz Gesundheit und Rassismus, health and racism, because we don't study the effects of racism on health in Germany. We studied for a very long time the effects of migration on health, and that was like studying how healthy or not are people with a migration background, but that's not the same thing as studying racism-based traumatic stress, which is like symptoms addressing the mental aspects, but also the body symptoms. Please be aware that.
No, thank you for that. Just want to kind of highlight in the chat, there's some very good information being disseminated. So please also just look at a few of those links are really, really helpful. And as Marielle, you were talking, I'm also reminded of, I mean, within a kind of U.S. context, folks have talked about, for instance, the effects of what they call John Henryism. So after the African American folk hero who killed himself, according to the ballad, by trying to basically compete with the steam engine, right? So this idea that people of African descent, especially in the U.S. context, overcompensate for racism by working extra hard. And then there are also effects like hypertension, et cetera, that follow from certain types of overexertion. So I think, right, that work is emergent, but I think you're definitely right that it's really important. There is one last question I think in the Q&A. I'll just pop in and see. So there's Rosalind Williams. Hi. She's asking who adopted these children from Black American GIs and white German women.
Yes, thank you for that question. The vast majority of these children were adopted by Black American families. Some of these were military families who had been stationed in Germany and adopted a child here. Most of them adopted a child through Mabel grammar, then maybe also with the assistance of the International Social Service, and most of these couples came from the urban north, greater Washington area or Chicago. And yeah, many of them were middle class, had the means to provide for an additional child or a child, and many of them had their stories featured in the newspaper. Um, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks to all those again in the chat, especially for pointing out the many resources already available through the BGHRA. We appreciate those for sure. And thank you to all three of our presenters. I'm really happy the way that I was telling Rose this before the conference started, that the program kind of exists and we kind of see the official curriculum, and then the conversations happen and we see kind of other unexpected connections. And so I think that even today with this panel, just the ways in which the conversation has kind of moved back and forth, and we've seen different revelations. It's just a sign of the richness of the work and the people who are presenting here. So thank you to all three of you, but also to our online audience. We appreciate all of you. I'm looking forward to the rest of the panelists for today. All right. See you in a little while. Thank you.
Thank you and
Thank you.
bye.